Well, good evening and welcome. We are going to allow participants to join for a few moments and then we'll get started. Good evening. My name is Ryan Burrows, Executive Director of the American Kratom Association. I want to thank you for joining us this evening, as I know it is a busy time for all of you this holiday season. With an immense effort by the AKA and our advocacy partners, we are thrilled to announce the historic bipartisan introduction of the Federal Kratom Consumer Protection Act. We understand there are a lot of questions around the potential bill, so we didn't want to wait any longer before holding a webinar to provide more details, possible outcomes, and impacts of this legislation. We will close tonight with a Q&A period for those on the call. Thank you all again for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Mac Haddo, our Senior Fellow on Public Policy.
Thank you, Ryan, and thanks to everyone for joining us, and certainly our best wishes for a very happy holiday season for everyone on this call. And we're particularly grateful at this juncture for the effort that was put forth by some of our champions in the Congress in order to move the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And the most important thing that we could be doing right now is obviously to work to make sure that we get this act passed. I had set this up on a screen that we'll see if this moves through. Our champions on the House side, Congressman Mark Pocan from Wisconsin, who has been a magnificent and tireless champion for us since 2016. And it's through his hard work and his setting the stage that we're able to convince Senator Mike Lee from Utah, who's a Republican, and Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, who's a Democrat, to join on the Senate side with the Protect Consumer Access to Kratom Act, which I want to spend a little bit of time explaining what it does, what the differences are between the state Kratom Consumer Protection Acts, and why this legislation is critically important to us as we move forward here. In a summary of S5319 and HR 9634, the Protecting Consumer Access to Kratom Act, understand that this will be refiled in the new Congress. And when it is, we want to attract as many co-sponsors as possible to join us in making sure that this legislation gets a hearing, where we have the opportunity to vet all of the issues that are surrounding the problems that we're having with consumer access that are largely the result of the FDA's overregulation of Kratom, and they're constructively abusing their regulatory authority, which I'll explain here in just a minute. But the important thing is that everyone contact your congressional representatives and encourage them to support the Protecting Consumer Access to Kratom Act, and you'll be able to use these bill numbers. And of course, everyone understands will be refiled, and we'll be able to work through it. So the first thing that this new legislation does, it protects the consumer access to Kratom from the FDA to continuing to abuse its regulatory authorities. We know that they have used import alerts from day one. In 2012, when they put the first import alert into place, it was designed to have a broad prohibition on Kratom coming into the United States. Typically, the FDA's authority to use an import alert is designed to protect against an individual vendor who is shipping a contaminated or an adulterated product into the United States. But in this case, the FDA has used, because it has broad discretionary authority to do so under the statute, they've banned all Kratom raw materials on the premise that they are either an unapproved new drug because of therapeutic claims that are made by some vendors in the United States. And by the way, the FDA is right about that. They're not permitted to make those illegal therapeutic claims. And the second premise they have is that all Kratom raw materials, either they were used for an unapproved new drug, or They are used as a dietary supplement for which there has not been a new dietary ingredient notification registered with the FDA. And of course, the NDIN process, the new dietary ingredient notification, is the byproduct of the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act that was passed in 1994. And the compromise in that bill was that for any dietary ingredient or dietary supplement that was in commerce in the United States prior to October 15th of 1994, they were grandfathered in and generally recognized as safe and allowed to be marketed. We know that the Kratom was in the United States. It was not as prominent as it is today, but it was brought here by, which we'll discuss in a few minutes, by the returning Vietnam soldiers who found it to be very useful for an energy boost and to help them with pain associated with long days in their war in the jungle. And then we know that there was a significant influx of Hmong populations that came to the United States after the war who used Kratom in their conventional diet. But we know that the FDA standards are that they refuse to accept any kind of evidence unless it was from a software system generating a receipt for Kratom, or it was in a catalog advertising Kratom raw materials, which of course we know Kratom never got to that point in terms of that volume at that time anyway, or prior to 1994. And so we're stuck with the very difficult bar that the FDA has set in order to qualify for a pre-1994 sale. So absent that, Kratom has to be submitted as a new dietary ingredient notification, and the FDA controls that process completely. There have been a half dozen NDIN applications filed. All have been rejected by the FDA. And of course, their argument is that they don't meet the standard. And it's possible that some of those didn't meet the standard, but there are certainly a couple that did, based on prior experience and on the FDA's own decision-making that they've made for similar products, but they decided to ratchet down on Kratom because of their bias against it. And so we're left with having to create a bypass of that Import Alert Authority and the NDIN Authority, and they will know this legislation were to pass, they'd no longer be able to classify Kratom as an adulterated food, as a dietary supplement, dietary ingredient, or new dietary ingredient requiring registration, or a new drug. They would have to base every decision related to Kratom based on scientific evidence and data, not their bias against Kratom or other herbal supplements, which we know they have had for decades as they proceeded to enforce their own authorities about it. The second thing that this legislation would do would be to require full transparency on all research on Kratom research being funded by the federal government. The FDA would be required to disclose the results of current Kratom science that currently have restrictions on researchers from disclosing the results without the FDA approval. All of this was announced back in August of 2021, where the FDA said that they were going to do a dose finding study and a safety study on Kratom, but you could not apply to receive the grant to do this study without committing to an unprecedented restriction on the disclosure of the data once it was produced. And that was that a researcher would not be able to publish any articles or to disclose the results without specific FDA approval. Even Commissioner Califf, when he was presented with this information, said that he would never have approved that kind of restriction on the research, but he's done nothing to unwind the restriction that was placed, and the leading researchers on Kratom in America all declined to participate in the FDA study. This will require the FDA to be fully transparent, publish the information, give the information to members of Congress and congressional committees, and make it publicly available as well. The third thing it would do is it would require the HHS to convene a Kratom task force that would hold public meetings with experts to increase the awareness of Kratom research and to identify the prevalence of and the current safe uses of Kratom, its potential health benefits, and would require the FDA to publish the records of all Kratom research on an FDA-designated Kratom website. We think that's important for public transparency. That public meeting would have to be held to allow the public to make comments and to participate actively in the process. The fourth thing that the bill will do is require the FDA to open a public docket for public comment prior to the hearings on Kratom, and requires the publication on the FDA website of all public comments, and transcripts of all the hearings conducted pursuant to the requirements of this act. That's important because we know that the FDA has used its bully pulpit to convince influencers in the medical space like WebMD, Mayo Clinic, and the Cleveland Clinic to republish inaccurate and definitely tainted information about Kratom. Here, the FDA would be required to put it up on a website, publish the comments, the transcripts. And when we have scientists who will testify about the safety profile of Kratom and its addiction liability limitations, then that will eviscerate the ability of the FDA to continue their war on Kratom, because they would be required to have on their website, and we could certainly point to it, the safety profile and the addiction profile of Kratom as it truly is represented with research. So the question that we have in order to explain to members of Congress, and these are the questions they always ask: why and how is Kratom used? Well, we know that a significant portion of the population, the Kratom population, uses it as a replacement for a cup of coffee for an energy boost and increased focus. Another group of consumers, roughly a third of the consumers in each category, use Kratom to reduce anxiety and reduce feelings of depression. This is documented in the Grunman study in 2017. And then you have the third category where people reduce the symptoms of acute and chronic pain and manage their pain, and importantly, have found Kratom to be successful in helping them to wean off of drugs that have a much higher safety and addiction profile. And that's why Dr. Giroir, the Assistant Secretary for Health at HHS, in 2016, wrote his scathing rebuke of the FDA for their attempts to schedule Kratom. And it is a document that every Kratom advocate should be familiar with. Read it and see exactly what a clear-thinking public health official would say about Kratom against the FDA's full-throated biased attacks on Kratom and how we can respond to them. Kratom consumers in the United States had it introduced by, as I mentioned earlier, U.S. soldiers in Vietnam who used it for the energy boost and minor pain relief, and they brought it home with them. We knew there was that significant influx of Hmong immigrants in the 70s and 80s who used Kratom as part of their conventional diet. And today, there are 12 to 15 million Kratom consumers in the United States who use Kratom regularly, and an estimated 2.5 million that use it to replace dangerously addictive pain medications that they have to use in order to maintain their health and well-being. How did we get here? Well, we know that the FDA's permissive policy on the use of opioids led to a huge spike in the use of those opioids and the addictions to them. And opioids, by the way, are not bad. That when they're properly prescribed, when they're managed by a physician, they are an important tool in order to help people with these issues. But the FDA simply opened the floodgates and allowed it. And in response to that, you saw the number of overdose deaths increase. And drug overdose deaths, not just opioids, but drug overdose in total, jumped to historical highs in the last year. Nearly 107,000 deaths were reported year to year in 2021. We knew that Kratom use was increasing at the same time, and actually dramatically, as consumers discovered its effects to help them reduce their reliance upon and to wean off of those more addictive pain medications. All of this is really important when you consider then what happened. The public was demanding action from the FDA. And what did the FDA do? Did they say, hey, we were wrong about the permissive policy that we had on the utilization of medications to help people with pain relief, the overprescribing of them? No, they said, oh, well, we want to propose Kratom scheduling. And that, of course, leads us as to why that biased approach and why they fill the pipeline with disinformation about Kratom and why we confront that today. The Kratom regulation timeline, I think most of us know. The FDA claimed imminent federal scheduling without a final decision from either HHS or the DEA. They told the states from 2012 to 2016, brace up, we're going to schedule Kratom. You might as well go ahead and start in your states and get ahead of the curve because it takes time to schedule these. And they characterized Kratom as a very dangerous, adulterated drug. And they said it was an opioid, which of course, chemically and legally it is not. And yet they persisted with that even after you had Dr. Giroir rebuke them in the way that he did, but they kept that letter secret for 2 years, as we all know. But between 2012 and 2017, 6 states did enact a kratom ban based on the FDA's lobbying: Alabama, Arkansas, Indiana, Wisconsin, Vermont, and Rhode Island. Those were mistakes. We know that they were mistakes based on the new emerging science that has now evolved, and why we fight so hard today to inform these legislatures that they made a mistake. And we know that we're having great traction in Wisconsin, Rhode Island, and Vermont, and in Indiana. And I think with the recent tragic situation in Arkansas, we have a real chance of getting that one up, that ban upset as well in the upcoming legislative sessions. We're going to work hard on those things. But the inaccurate FDA data that they were pushing out relentlessly was republished. And I emphasize it was republished by numerous medical groups, including the Mayo Clinic, WebMD, and Cleveland Clinic, and others. There hasn't been a single bit of research done by the Mayo Clinic, and yet they are the ones who are the top Google search when you Google Kratom, to see them republish and repeat the inaccurate information that's provided by the Food and Drug Administration. And they do so under an agreement with the FDA, and they have no interest in, the Mayo Clinic at least, in doing any independent research, despite our attempts to try to help them do that independent research and fund it without restrictions. They declined. And we know today that as we go into state and local governments, that we hear about the medical associations and some law enforcement groups who have been seduced into this inaccurate narrative by the FDA, and they repeat the inaccurate information in order to justify bans in both state and local governments. We fight hard every day, and with your help, we've been successful, at least at the state level, and we've got real challenges ahead of us at the local, county, and city levels. As all of you know, we're seeing some activity in Louisiana and Mississippi increase as these misinformed groups continue to peddle the nonsense from the FDA. We know that the regulatory timeline is clear, that on October 13th, 2016, the DEA withdrew the August 31st, 2016 notice of intent to schedule. That would have scheduled Kratom for 2 years. It is called the Emergency Powers section of the Controlled Substances Act. It would have allowed, without public comment, the DEA to formally schedule it, and we would have been without Kratom for that 2-year period. It was only because of the outcry of the Kratom community, because 51 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, in a bipartisan, full-throated opposition, said no. 13 members of the United States Senate, Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah, one of the most conservative members, and Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont, one of the most liberal members, who joined together to tell the DEA, do not take this action. And the DEA responded. And they did some interesting things. They said, we're withdrawing it because we think that you have not proven your case. And you, the FDA, will now have to produce a full 8-factor analysis. Don't try to go around the 8 factors by submitting an emergency application, but let's see the entire body of evidence that you have. We know that on August the 16th of 2018, Dr. Joie rejected summarily the application that had been submitted and signed off by his immediate predecessor and acting assistant secretary, who just rubber stamped the FDA's recommendation and sent it on to the Drug Enforcement Administration. And it was that August 16th, 2018 letter that is the benchmark. It is the Bible for why the FDA is wrong about Kratom. They're wrong on the science. They're wrong on the public policy. Kratom is a harm reduction tool. And he cited the fact that the FDA's error was in not looking at emerging science and not considering the public health impacts, the substantial risk to public health if Kratom were to be scheduled at this time. Now, interestingly, as we all know, that letter was kept secret until January of 2020 at the behest of the FDA, who used the FOIA restriction on ongoing regulations to block its disclosure. And it was only because of Congressman Pocan and Congressman Griffiths from Virginia who stepped up and asked the HHS for the letter, and they disclosed it under a congressional request that found that the rescission letter had been issued. Now, importantly, everyone needs to understand the context. Even after this letter was formally delivered to the FDA and obviously to the DA to remove the scheduling, Commissioner Gottlieb knew what the position of Dr. Joie was. He knew the complaint that Dr. Joie gave and the scathing rebuttal that he provided. And a month later, Dr. Gottlieb, the commissioner of FDA, was peddling his disinformation to the media because he knew that this letter could not be made public. He blocked it and then lied to the American public. That's tragic when you look at the current position of the Food and Drug Administration with Commissioner Califf, where he decries the disinformation that's out in the public, in his view, about the COVID crisis. And yet he will not step up and say to his policy staff, you need to stop the disinformation from the FDA on Kratom. We hope that at some point, Dr. Califf will come to his senses and force the FDA to do the right thing. We all know that on December 1st of 2021, the World Health Organization, through the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, which is comprised of 12 international experts from around the globe on substance abuse and addiction liability issues, evaluated everything that the FDA submitted to them. They threw the kitchen sink at the expert committee. They had months, 2 months of lobbying them directly. We had an hour in order to make a presentation to that group. But they concluded at the end of that exhaustive, comprehensive review that what didn't even merit a critical review, which would have triggered a 1-year evaluation of Kratom at the international level. The evidence was so bad that the expert committee said there's insufficient evidence to recommend even a critical review, and they voted unanimously to reject it. And so they took the lowest level of surveillance, which they were allowed to recommend, and that's what we ended up with. The FDA got their hat handed to them for the 3rd time. Normally, you would think 3 strikes and you're out, but unfortunately, the FDA doesn't think that way. In response to a letter from Congressman Pocan and Senator Lee asking, in light of the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence's position on Kratom, what is the position of HHS with respect to Kratom? And this letter in March of 2016, of 2021, March 16, 2022, is important because Secretary Becerra said, while options for scheduling have been discussed, we believe that additional data and information are needed to understand the public health impact of Kratom in terms of therapeutic benefits as well as the safety risk. And significantly, he said many Kratom-involved overdose deaths have occurred after the use of adulterated Kratom products or taking Kratom with other substances. This is an important safety issue because we know that there are many in the community who believe that Kratom was responsible for the death of their loved one. These are tragic circumstances, and we certainly feel badly for all of those people that have lost a loved one. But it is important that we let one thing dictate our position on Kratom, and that is we let the science do it. But if you let scheduling be the thing that drives the public policy, here's the consequences of that. In terms of consumer protection, food safety standards are ignored. We saw a salmonella outbreak of contaminated Kratom in 2018 that was directly as a result of the FDA's failure in order to maintain safety protocols to check for Kratom raw materials coming into the United States. And that's why you had the salmonella outbreak. You have over criminalization. Consumers may be arrested, imprisoned, or lose child custody. We've helped with numerous child custody cases where the spouse blames Kratom use by the other spouse as a basis for interfering with their custodial rights of a child. That's unfair, and it's wrong because it's not based on good science. And we know of the tragic outcome of an individual who was arrested in Arkansas who received, because Kratom was scheduled, and the scheduling procedures in Arkansas were horrific when it comes to following good public policy and the procedures that are required by their law, yet they scheduled it. And we know that Marshall Price was sentenced to 10 years in jail for possession of Kratom, which was nothing more than Kratom that he had purchased legally in the state of Missouri, had transported across state lines, and was using it for his own use to manage an addiction that he had been struggling with for years. He ended up dying in custody of the jail, and that, of course, is being investigated now. And no reason for that other than the FDA had misled Arkansas in passing that ban. We know that 6 states have passed the restrictions on Kratom, have imposed criminal penalties. It's simply wrong, and that's what a scheduling consequence delivers to us. Then there's economic stagnation. We know that credit processors reject payments because of the FDA's position. We know that the investment in manufacturing business is limited, and therefore you don't have quality manufacturers getting into the business to provide real competition, and you have trade and industry growth stunted because of the bans. 200,000 poor Indonesian families who rely upon Kratom for their livelihood suffer from the import alerts imposed by the FDA. And I can tell you from my personal conversations with Indonesian government officials, they're very concerned that the FDA is creating this kind of adverse outcome for these 200,000 poor Indonesian families. The Thailand government seeks to invest in Kratom farming and impose appropriate regulations, and they're moving ahead with that, but they're getting stymied by threats from the FDA about the import alerts and how they will stop them. And then, of course, we have research barriers. There's no Kratom research supply of pure Kratom that is easily attainable because of the import alert. We know that potential solutions to the opioid epidemic are unexplored, and we're scratching the surface with the research that's being conducted and funded by the National Institutes on Drug Abuse. But we know that more would be done if this ridiculous import alert were lifted. And then you have FDA, NIDA, and pharma companies unable to source research-grade Kratom in order to conduct the kind of studies that would be essential. We know that even the study that was proposed by the FDA in August of 2021 suffered from the inability to get pharmaceutical-grade Kratom in order to conduct their study. We believe at the American Kratom Association that science should dictate public policy on Kratom. We don't buy or sell Kratom. We protect consumers' access to it so that they can make responsible, informed decisions about responsibly using Kratom for maintaining their health and well-being. We know that the National Institutes on Drug Abuse in their drug facts said it right. And this goes to the heart of the concern of many people about whether Kratom is toxic. And they address specifically the FDA reports about Kratom being responsible for or causing deaths. They highlight on their website, the FDA reports note that many of the Kratom-associated deaths appear to have resulted from adulterated products or taking Kratom with other potent substances, including illicit drugs, opioids, benzodiazepines, alcohol, gabapentin, and over-the-counter medications, such as cough syrup. Also, there have been some reports that Kratom packaged as dietary supplements or dietary ingredients that were laced with other compounds that caused deaths. Unfortunately, I believe that that's been the catalyst for many of these allegations about Kratom causing a death. And make no mistake, the influence of the Food and Drug Administration on the medical examiners in the country, combined with what I think are completely bizarre justifications by some of the toxicology groups that make their money on doing testing of forensics screens after a death, are promoting the idea that metrogenine or acute metrogenine toxicity can cause a death. The science doesn't justify that. It is unfortunate but true that it might just be an underlying health condition. It could be the inadvertent use of Kratom with another prescription medication or completely unrelated other over-the-counter medications or illicit drugs or prescription drugs that are being taken that are contraindicated for use at the same time. And Kratom just happens to be one of the substances that the person might be consuming along with any number of other dietary supplements or herbal supplements that the individual may be using. But to blame Kratom is simply wrong when it isn't justified with the science. I know that there are many well-intentioned and I believe people who honestly think that Kratom was responsible for the death of their loved one. We empathize with them, we sympathize with them, but we think that they should know the truth, as should every individual in this whole chain of custody of these kinds of reports, including medical examiners, should know the truth about it and not be misled by what the FDA's pernicious campaign in order to circulate disinformation about Kratom. And we're willing to go head-to-head with all of them on the science. We know that the National Institutes on Drug Abuse looked at the issue about addiction liability. Now, can someone become dependent on Kratom? Yes. Is it dangerously addictive? And that's the standard that scientists use. And if it were true, what the FDA were saying, that Kratom is, in its pure form, is so dangerously addictive it should be scheduled, then it would be scheduled today. But we know that the NIDA looked into this by commissioning 2 concurrent studies in 2018. One was contracted out. Dr. Henby and his colleagues looked at the abuse liability of kratom, alkaloids, metrogene and 7-hydroxymetrogene, and they concluded that the present findings indicate metrogene does not have abuse potential and reduces morphine intake, desired characteristics of a candidate pharmacotherapies for opioid addiction and withdrawal. They found that the test animals that were evaluated, and this is the gold standard for all dietary supplements to actually do these kinds of tests, and they determined there was no abuse potential, and it actually reduced the cravings for the reference drug used in the study, which was morphine. At the same time, and published just 2 weeks later, and a lab within NIDA conducted similar studies, and they found a limited abuse liability for metrogene and the potential for metrogene treatment to specifically reduce opioid abuse. This is why when Dr. Joie looked at it and evaluated it in context, and I should tell you that Dr. Joie told me personally he was not a kratom advocate. He was an advocate for good science. And when he looked at the FDA's claims about kratom, he found them to be wanting, that they simply did not meet the criteria. And here's why. Because you see in these studies, they find that kratom can actually help people that are struggling with opioid abuse, and that's why he called it a harm reduction tool that should be available. When asked on May 17th of 2022 in a Senate hearing as to what the NIH was doing in order to stem this opioid or drug overdose crisis in America, Dr. Volko, the director of NIDA, said there's also interest in the community to test other products that may serve as harm reduction. For example, the use of kratom, which is sold as tea and that contains a drug or a molecule that has effects that are similar to a dose of buprenorphine, a safe and effective treatment for opioid use disorder, but could be utilized also for decreasing withdrawal depression. Dr. Volko didn't make that up. She was reflecting upon the science that has been conducted by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, taxpayer funding research, and that, of course, has resonated with the Congress because in the FY23 Appropriations Act that was just passed, the committee commends NIDA for funding studies on kratom based on promising results that unadulterated kratom may provide help for some Americans struggling with addictions, given its analgesic and less addictive properties as compared to opioids. What a fantastic scientific conclusion, as opposed to the kind of craziness that the FDA circulates and misleads people with when it comes to kratom. Dr. Garcia Romeo from Johns Hopkins University looked at a survey of adult kratom consumers, and he found that kratom is used among white middle-aged Americans for symptoms of pain, anxiety, depression, and opioid withdrawal. Although regular use was typical, kratom-related substance use disorder and serious adverse events were uncommon. And that's, of course, the scientific standard as to whether or not a substance when it's used responsibly is in fact going to create problems in terms of its addiction liability or its safety. And here he found that those were uncommon. And that's not a good standard for anyone to be scheduling this. And among those kratom consumers who were using kratom to treat opioid dependence, 87% reported that relief from withdrawal symptoms. That's the hardest thing, getting off of addictions. And 35% were free from opioids within a year, using kratom to replace it, to manage their acute and chronic pain. That's the science that drives this, not the wild, crazy accusations that are made by a group of policy people at the FDA that simply no longer have the kind of basis to make the claims that they've made. Dr. Christopher McCurdy, the leading scientist on kratom safety and addiction, reported on June of this year. He said, "We know that very few deaths are attributable to a kratom product alone, and for those that are, there could be extreme circumstances in terms of overdosing, or it could be adulterated with synthetic compounds such as fentanyl derivatives or other novel psychoactive substances that are unknown or undetected." Part of the science of this is to find the truth about a death. And if they don't do a screen or a panel testing for substances, and they just say, oh, well, we know the person was using kratom, so therefore the medical examiner coroner says this is a death that's caused by metrogene toxicity, that is an invalid conclusion. It is wrong. It is wrong for the family members who believe that kratom may have caused the death of the individual in their family. It is wrong for scientists who know that in fact you can't draw that causality unless you do an exhaustive panel of studies. It benefits only the tox screen companies that market their screening products that say that they'll test for kratom because they charge more for doing that and they make a lot of money at it. And it also benefits trial lawyers that are exploiting families in order to make a buck, finding a pocket that they can pick in order to make their case that kratom is somehow dangerous. We grieve along with those families for anyone who's lost in this battle with addiction liability, or even those that are just inadvertently, while using kratom, having issues with their underlying health conditions that cause a death. That does not mean, nor is it justified for a conclusion to be drawn that kratom was the cause of the death. We're looking at every autopsy and tox screen that we can acquire and examining them to determine whether or not there's a valid conclusion being made by these medical examiners. And frankly, we're finding that many of them are simply incomplete and wrong. In October of 2022, Dr. Garcia Romeo, Dr. Grunman, Dr. Henningfield, and Dr. Eustace published a kratom science update with evidence-based facts where they argue for balanced regulation to ensure that kratom products that are purchased by consumers are pure and unadulterated. So it meets the same standard as other food products, even bottled water. And they say that steps that where such standards are taken in states that passed their own versions of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act provide that authority. And ultimately, it's up to the FDA, and now with this federal legislation, we hope they will, to develop national performance standards for kratom as it does for other products. Abandon their war and start to protect consumers. We think that's important, and we think that those standards will help ensure access to safe kratom products that are appropriately marketed and they're without contaminants and adulterants that might pose safety risks. And it's important here to also understand that as we look at this landscape of kratom use, that we want consumers to be protected. We know that if you are taking an adulterated product, that you are at risk. You might have a stronger effect than pure kratom gives you, and maybe that's attractive to some consumers. That's not pure kratom, and certainly put your lives at risk. The interesting question that's been raised by the FDA over and over again is whether or not kratom acts like opioids, because, as the FDA claims, kratom hits the opioid receptors in the brain. That's only partially true. It does hit the mu-opioid receptor, as do many, many, many products. The question is, what are the effects? And we know that the science concludes that kratom is a partial agonist. It doesn't have the same effects as an opioid or a prescription medication. It doesn't go to the same euphoric high center of the brain where you get the cravings to come back. It doesn't go to the respiratory system. But the FDA kept saying, no, you're wrong, you're wrong. It certainly does that. So there was a study conducted, recently published, that used the FDA recommended protocol for evaluating respiratory depression. They published this protocol. And this scientific research project used the FDA's protocol. They call it the oxycodone protocol. They matched it against the doses of oxycodone, which are well known in terms of their effects. And we match kratom against that. And when you look at it, when you look at the volume of kratom, the science director that conducted this study actually didn't see any effects in the lowest dose or the mid dose, and finally made the recommendation to conclusively show that kratom is safe, that he would take the highest volume of metrogenine that he could get into a solution that could be injected into the test animals, which ended up being hundreds of times more than any human could consume in a day, to determine what there was going to be respiratory depression. There was not only no respiratory depression at the highest level that they could get into the test animals of this solution containing metrogenine, they also didn't see any blood oxygen suppression of any significance. Certainly there was sedation at the highest levels, but everything that they expected from oxycodone, including deaths of the test animals, occurred, and kratom did not show those kinds of outcomes. When this study was presented to the FDA scientists reportedly were amazed and wowed by it. But the FDA policy people, who are not scientists, rejected it. And that's unfortunate, because, again, in the quest for science, we ought to be finding the right thing. So in conclusion, we know that the FDA regulation on kratom got ahead of the science. They used their bias to drive public policy, not the truth. Kratom science has advanced significantly since 2016. So even if you give the FDA the benefit of the doubt that in 2016, they had some basis to be concerned about Kratom. They certainly had that thrown out the window in 2018 when Dr. Joie informed them that their science was disappointingly poor on evidence and data required for scheduling. The 8 factors under the Controlled Substances Act require regulation of Kratom, not scheduling. And the next step is, and this is where we need everyone's help, contact your House and Senate representatives immediately. Ask them to co-sponsor and support the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, protecting consumer access to Kratom in the new Congress. Every call will make a difference. Tell your story. Now, I know that there will be people who are on the other side of this issue who will hear this message, and they'll say, we're going to call and we're going to tell them about how dangerous Kratom is. They're already doing it, and I understand that. And I don't begrudge them their ability in a free society to make those claims, but they need to back it up with science. But what everyone can do in the Kratom community that has found Kratom to be valuable in their experience is to call and give your personal testimony. You don't have to restate the science. You don't have to remember all of the details and what I've covered here tonight. You have to tell your story, your experience. And I can tell you in the thousands of testimonials that I have heard across the country, as I've been in hearing after hearing, that resonates because these public policy officials, these legislators want to hear the truth. And we'll let those in the Kratom Danger Awareness Group sound off. They can, and they're entitled to that. They have the freedom to do that, but we can overwhelm them with the truth. And then when it's appropriate, we'll provide the science, not the recapitulation of the FDA message, which has seduced many of these people into believing something that's wrong, not the decisions made by medical examiners based on the FDA's nonsense and their disinformation, but rather the truth. And that's what we want to, of course, articulate across the board. So I know that there's a lot of concern that people have, and rightfully so, that Kratom is being attacked by the FDA and being attacked in the community by people who have lost loved ones who feel strongly that Kratom should be banned. And our answer to that is simple. Let's let science dictate that answer. And I'm confident if we do that, that we're going to be able to do exactly what we need to do in terms of the Kratom community in protecting consumer access to Kratom. And so I ask everyone to join. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ryan, and we can field some questions that anyone might have about Kratom.
Mac, thank you for that. Our first question this evening, please clarify for attendees, if you can, the transparency the bill requires. Is it just focused on FDA, or does it also require same of NIH or others?
So it requires all federally funded Kratom research to be published. The FDA has to put it on their website. There will be a Kratom section of the FDA website, so they can't escape that responsibility. And we put it there because the FDA is the one who is the protagonist for this disinformation, and they're going to have to be able to explain why they put up this legitimate information and science on Kratom on the FDA website. But all federally funded research will be published there.
Great, thank you. And maybe more of a statement, but marijuana is legal. Why not this?
Well, marijuana is not legal, by the way, except for THC content in hemp products of 0.3% or under. Now, many states have proactively taken advantage of that particular position by the Congress. The FDA ignores it. They do not have safety standards for CBD products today. But marijuana itself is legal in some states, and it's still a scheduled substance federally, but the states have proactively taken control of that issue, and frankly, the federal government's lost that war. We want the same to be true for different reasons for Kratom going forward.
Great, thank you. And would the federal KCPA override and lift any current state and local bans that are already in effect?
No, every state's going to have to evaluate their situation differently. There's no preemption in the federal law. Simply saying that the FDA regulates Kratom will take away the argument that many Kratom detractors make that it's dangerous and it needs to be banned. We know that in the state of Wisconsin, that they're moving quickly to deschedule it, and we think we'll be successful in this legislative session. The Controlled Substances Board held a hearing about a month ago on Kratom, and they were required by the legislature to make a report by January of 2023, prior to the start of the legislative session, about whether or not Kratom meets the 8 factors that mirror the federal statute. Well, if the federal statute, the Controlled Substances Act, doesn't allow for scheduling of Kratom based on the criteria that's been evaluated by Dr. Joie, what do the people in Wisconsin know that's different than that? But at the hearing, it was interesting, as Dr. Henningfield and I prepared to testify, the staff informed us that they had a surprise witness, Dr. Cunningham from the, I've forgotten the name of the college now, Concordia College of Wisconsin School of Pharmacy. We had no idea what he was going to say. But what he did is he reported that his senior class of pharmacy students had, as a class project, adopted the project of evaluating whether or not Kratom met the 8 factors under Wisconsin law for scheduling. And Dr. Cunningham explained that after an exhaustive review of all the published literature and the information that was available, they concluded that it was not schedulable, that it was inappropriate for it to be scheduled. That was a powerful message. And then Dr. Cunningham fielded 25 minutes of intense questions from the members of the Controlled Substance Board, of which he answered magnificently. And so I think that it's going to be hard for certainly the legislature and the Controlled Substance Board to do anything but acknowledge that that research concluded that the law is not supported by the scheduling that is currently in place. We had meetings with the interim director of the Rhode Island Department of Health and her staff, and she acknowledged in our meeting that Kratom does not meet the scheduling criteria under Rhode Island law. So we look forward to that one being descheduled. And we're working in Vermont and Indiana. You will see a repeal law in Indiana that will be filed this year, and we're getting great traction in that state. So we're working hard to get these things done, but we need to have as many states who will pass the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, because it's different. What we're asking the states to do is to ensure that there are standards when Kratom products are introduced for sale in their state, that they have to meet the criteria of good manufacturing practices, properly labeled and not adulterated with either by synthesizing any of the alkaloids or adding dangerous substances to it. And they have to be labeled properly in order for them to be sold. And we think that's an important effort, and we're going to continue to work hard on it.
Excellent. And has anyone FOIA'd FDA for correspondence between pharma and FDA regarding Kratom? I'm highly suspicious that they want to schedule Kratom so they can sell it in the detox centers and treatment facilities.
Well, I know, and I have my own suspicions about the relationship between pharma and Kratom. There's obviously an interest by pharma in selling any product that they can patent and then sell and have an exclusive marketplace to. And the big impediment to that is that Kratom, if it's available in its natural form, has the same effects in terms of helping people. Now, they might be able to chemically synthesize the alkaloids, and they might be able to induce a power to those alkaloids that would require it to be a prescription medication, and God love them if they do that. But what we do know, and you know, obviously I've just described the tension, but what we do know is that the Dr. Scott Gottlieb now is a board member at Pfizer, and Pfizer's a pharma company. What we do know is that Pfizer has what they characterize as a non-addictive pain medication therapy that has been rejected by the advisory committee to the FDA, and that's stung. And you've got Dr. Gottlieb, who persists in his campaign against Kratom, because Kratom is the biggest competitor to what will be Pfizer's product if they were be able to secure an approval from the FDA, because you won't need Pfizer's product for a non-addictive therapy to help you wean off of opioids. And so I think that that's a good enough connection for me. The most important thing from my perspective is that we look at the science and let science speak about Kratom in terms of its addiction liability, its safety, and its effects. And we think that Dr. Joie said it right, not being an advocate for Kratom, but an advocate for good science. And he saw that the FDA was wrong on Kratom. And the only other argument to be made is Kratom can help people. It's a harm reduction tool. And we should follow the lead of the National Institute on Drug Abuse and Dr. Volko, who regularly touts the benefits from a harm reduction standpoint of Kratom in this space.
Great. And I can give my testimony to my reps, but can we mention the FDA using flawed data?
Well, sure, you can. I can tell you that's the argument we are providing. I encourage everyone to go to kratomanswers.org and refer every staffer that you talk to go to that website. That will speak for you there in terms of the detail. Let that website and let the AKA, with our advocacy efforts and our shoe leather up on Capitol Hill, make the scientific arguments, but just refer them to that website. But your story, your personal story, is so much more powerful when it comes to the experience that you've had with Kratom and that has helped you or saved your life. And I can tell you that as I have talked to state legislators and federal legislators who have heard those impassioned testimonies, they resonate. And I encourage everyone to use that platform as best you can and leave the discussion and the investigation into science to the kratomanswers.org website. And certainly if you have a question that a staffer asked that you cannot get answered, let us know, and we'll certainly jump into the breach and talk to those staffers or members.
Great. Can you email to us sample emails or sample dialogue to use when contacting our government officials? Robert, I will share with you my email and send that to you directly here in just a few moments. If we
Good. So I'll tell you what my call, you call, you're going to get a staffer. You're not going to get the member. It's very rare that you would get a member. And pitch is very simple. My name is Mac Haddo. I use Kratom. I do, by the way. I use Kratom and it helps me. And I want you to support the federal legislation that will protect my access to Kratom. And here's why it's important. And then you tell your personal story. That will make a difference. That will get the attention of that staffer because they're human beings too. And so this is something that we need to be in there fighting for, and we need to tell your story because that will move mountains in the face of all of the counter lobbying that the other side is going to be doing. They're entitled to do that, but the one thing they cannot do is they can't let science speak because the science is on our side, and it's funded by NIDA, not us. This is just something, we have small pieces of the science, but the overall volume of science that's being conducted by the National Institute on Drug Abuse is powerful, and the HHS has affirmed it, and you have Secretary Becerra affirming it right now. And the only outlier in Washington, D.C. today is the FDA. They're just like the stubborn little child that won't change their mind because they want to be right. And we simply have to keep fighting against that.
Excellent. And if we do not get the KCPA passed this legislative season, will the AKA file again next year?
Yes. Now, sometimes these are long battles. And I had an interesting conversation with a person that said, well, legislation takes a long time and all that. It does. But one thing in my experience in more than 40 years in Washington, D.C., I have never seen a bill pass that wasn't first introduced. So what we want to do is have it introduced, and now that's happened. It will be reintroduced in January. We want to make sure we get a hearing so that both sides can provide the evidence. We want that to happen. We encourage it to happen. We support it happening, and we want the science to come out. That'll happen. And then whether or not it goes through regular order and voted as an up or down on the bill itself, or it becomes, which is very common these days, part of an omnibus package, it will still protect consumers. So we're going to fight hard to get the Protecting Consumer Access to Kratom Act passed at the federal level. And we're going to be fighting this year in many, many states in getting the Kratom Consumer Protection Act passed.
Just a little further detail, Mac, on that. What is the timeline for discussion and voting on this bill? How much time do we have to contact our government officials?
So you don't have any time to contact your government officials other than now. Do it now, and do it over the next couple of weeks, and get it, and then call them again and follow up. The bill will be refiled probably in the third week in January, the first week in February, somewhere in that time frame. Congress will not be back in session full time until probably the first week in February. But we want to have everybody teed up. We want to get a lot of co-sponsors on the legislation. So reach out now and push for it. This session of Congress will last 2 years. So that gives us the opportunity to prosecute this legislation. The FDA is bonkers about it. The reason that we had such difficulty in getting it passed was that they were lobbying day and night against this legislation. We've been trying to get it introduced for a long time, and we finally overcame their objections by an evaluation of legislative leaders that listened to both sides. And they determined in the end that the FDA was wrong. Just like every other scientist, that looks at this with any kind of objectivity knows that the FDA is wrong. They're prosecuting an agenda that's based on a bias, not on science. And so we want science to prevail on this, and we know it will in the end.
And what is the status in Washington State? I don't see any progress from Senator Honeyford.
My understanding is Senator Honeyford has retired. We have some great advocates in Washington who are interested in pursuing this. We certainly are not going to see a ban, in my opinion. We haven't seen anything filed yet. We're working to try to get the bill filed, the KCPA filed, as the legitimate alternative. So I think that that's where we'll end up in many of these states, just fighting to get the KCPA filed and stop the bans. And when we see bans overturned that currently exist among the 6 states, I think that's going to be a powerful message to these other states that the choice is either ban it, where you end up with people in jail like happened in Arkansas and tragic outcomes from that, or you regulate it. And we want it to be regulated so the consumers are protected against adulterated kratom products and products that are not properly manufactured.
And from Wayne, can you analyze how strong the lobbying effort will be against the bill? Will Big Pharma play a big role?
I don't think Big Pharma is going to jump into this battle. They got lots of other battles to fight. I think the FDA will be their proxy. I think the FDA is going to be full-throated against this. They were full-throated against the Secretary Becerra making the statement he made in March of this year. They were full-throated against Secretary Giroir, Assistant Secretary of Health Giroir. They were against the DEA withdrawing it, and they lost. And so we're going to continue that win streak on our end and tell the truth, let the science speak.
How can we combat all of these acute mitragynine toxicity death claims from medical examiners? There's no established ID 50 for kratom, and these acute toxicity death claims are oftentimes very minute amounts of mitragynine. They're literally just called a death, acute mitragynine toxicity, because kratom happens to be in the decedent's blood at the time of their death.
So the LD50 for kratom is yet to be established. There's no question about that. But they typically, that kind of research and science is reserved for proven products that pose a threat or a safety risk. What we have here is a manufactured safety risk from the FDA, which Dr. Giroir called disappointingly poor evidence and data. They simply can't justify it. They make claims. This is the FDA that said that one of their deaths, their 44 deaths, that was caused by kratom, when you looked at the autopsy report, were 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. This is the same FDA that claimed that the kratom toxicity had killed people, and yet when you looked at and NIDA evaluated all those deaths too, and they all were polydrug use or underlying health conditions. None were kratom only. So the FDA is wrong about this, and they can't just keep talking loudly and expect people to believe them anymore, because we're sitting there right there in the same rooms, and we're saying, let's let the science speak. Let's look at their autopsy reports. The acute mitragynine toxicity is manufactured by the FDA, and they've convinced some of the testing labs who promote to these coroners and medical examiners that if you see a kratom being present in the tox screen, call it a toxic or a kratom death. We know that out in Idaho, there was a medical examiner who ruled a death for what it was, which is acute hypothermia. And the FDA called him and said, you need to call that a kratom death. They said, why? They said, well, because we saw the tox screen, they had kratom in his system. He said, so what? It had nothing to do with his death. He took that earlier in the day, and it certainly didn't impair him in any way. He died of hypothermia, and he was, by the way, drunk, and it had some other problems with other things in his system. And the FDA insisted that he changed the report. He said, I won't do it. And they threatened to call his boss. He said, I'll save you the trouble. Let's get her on the phone right now. And then the FDA backed off. This is what the FDA is doing. They're promoting a false narrative about kratom, and it's about time they got called on it. Now, there is a case which we're supporting from AKA, and you're supporting by virtue of it, with a medical examiner who did exactly what's just been described, and we're suing that medical examiner because nothing in the record supported the conclusion that it was kratom that caused the death. And we're going to get it on the record under oath what the basis for that was, because we know there isn't any legitimate basis. So we're going to continue to attack that. In the lawsuits that have been filed against kratom manufacturers and against the American Kratom Association, we're going to be out there fighting hard on this issue. We're going to let science prevail. Now, we don't sell kratom. We only recommend kratom that adheres to GMP compliance standards that we've set that are voluntarily complied with, documented by an independent third-party audit. But we don't sell kratom. We want people to use it responsibly. We want to make sure that you're safely doing it. So we're going to fight that battle, but we're going to be fighting against these medical examiners and coroners. And here's a perfect example. When you look, I saw a meme that was put up by one of these trial attorneys that's trying to solicit cases of people that believe that their loved one may have died from kratom. And again, enhancing this acute mitrogeny toxicity. And he cited the CDC report that he said that the CDC concluded that 91 people died of kratom. That is a bald-faced lie. And yet that's an attorney putting it out there, trying to get people who've had loved ones who died to say, I'll represent you. And yet he premises it on a lie, because what the CDC report actually said was they had reports from medical examiners and coroners within a set time period that they referred to the FDA, to the Centers for Disease Control, that said that there was kratom detected in the bloodstream of 91 decedents. And 68% of I don't know if I have the exact number, 60-some% were fentanyl. That's what killed people. Or it was heroin or morphine or buprenorphine, laced with all kinds of substances that reliably can be identified as the cause of death because of their toxicity level, not kratom. And yet this attorney will mislead people about that statement and claim the CDC did it. In fact, the CDC in that same report looked at the 7 kratom-only deaths. In other words, the medical examiners admitted that there were only 7 of the 150 total, 91 that they cite, and this attorney cited as having kratom specifically involved in the tox screen. And they said only 7 were kratom only. And when the FDA looked at those 7, for those that had blood samples, I think there were 4, all of them that had a blood sample was available to be retested using more sophisticated analytical tools, found that it was polydrug use. It wasn't kratom. So this nonsense that is being peddled in lawsuits around the country, and it's in the Alabama case and in your case, quoting the CDC report, are wrong. They're based on a lie. And it's about time they got called on it. And we're going to take advantage of the opportunity to do just that. We want the truth to come out for these families. We want people to understand the true level of risk that's associated with the consumption of kratom. There's no question that you can become dependent on kratom. It is possible, although we haven't seen one yet, that you might even overdose on kratom. We don't know, but we know that what public policy is based on is the risk factors, and just having an outlier where some, because of what Dr. McCurdy described as an unusual, extraordinary circumstance, someone might have died. We need to look more closely at that to determine what the real cause of death was, and not let these trial attorneys jump on this bandwagon that they've created, mislead people, and deprive these families of the truth. And that's what we want to be a part of in a constructive way in order to make sure that people have the best opportunity to understand the true safety profile and addiction liability of kratom. And the science is not going to lie. The attorneys might, but the science is not going to.
And is there any progress happening regarding deschedulizing kratom in Vermont? You touched on it earlier, but maybe just a little more update.
Sure, we're working with legislators and the Department of Health there. They're looking closely at what Rhode Island does. And so we're very encouraged by the response from the Department of Health there. I think we're going to do well in Vermont. I think that we have a very good chance of Wisconsin, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Indiana, and Arkansas all being wiped off in the next year or two from being bans. And we're going to fight to make that happen because it's based on good science, not on the outdated science that the FDA used to seduce those states into making the mistake that they made.
Excellent. Then any specific news on the ban in Alabama?
Race up. That's all I can tell you. Alabama is one of the toughest states. It's a very conservative southern state. I've had great conversations with a number of legislators there who don't believe that the District Attorneys Association, which led the fight on kratom, all based on the FDA's disinformation. So I think that'll be a longer project for us, but I think we'll eventually get there, particularly if we get a couple of states that are currently banned falling and going to the side of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. So I have hope for Alabama, but it's not going to be the first one to fall, I can tell you that.
And if kratom becomes prescription like marijuana in some states, will it still be legal and accessible to buy?
So that's a complicated question. If a state determines that they will create a category of sale to make it prescription only, that's inconsistent with federal law because only the FDA can make those kinds of decisions. Now, if a state slips by and does something like that, we would have to contend. We'll obviously oppose that. We think that the pure plant, unadulterated, properly manufactured, and labeled properly is a safe product that consumers can purchase without any kind of prescription. And look at what the bias that the FDA has created in the medical community. We know that from Dr. Grunman's survey, that 45+% of Americans who use Kratom tell their doctors about it. Now, the doctors typically don't know much about it, but they know that the FDA hates it. So they Google it and they see the Mayo Clinic and they see the FDA and they say, oh, don't use that stuff. Well, the truth is it's helping people. And it takes a forward-thinking, analytical view like Dr. Zawad took to say, what are the true effects? What does the science say? What are people experiencing as a harm reduction tool? And that's why he came to the conclusion that millions of Americans are put at risk with a ban on Kratom at the federal level. We think that's exciting. We're working with the former Office of Drug Control Policy in the White House, Jim Carroll, who is looking at this closely. And he has told me that he has real questions about the conclusions that the FDA were promoting during his tenure at the Office of Drug Control Policy and the work that they were doing with the DEA. So I think that we've got a real opportunity to shed light, to shine light on some of these accusations being made by the FDA. And I think that when that happens, that the rats will scurry to the corners, because that's what they are right now. They're simply disinformation rats that are out there promoting a narrative that's incorrect based on science.
And do you expect the KCPA to be a catalyst for similar legislations in other countries?
I do. We've been having conversations with the people in the Czech Republic. There's legislation being drafted right now. That's an ongoing effort. We are hosting a delegation from Malaysia at our offices next week. We have been working with the Indonesian government to prevent a ban there. We also are working with the Thai government. I met with the Secretary of Health there, the Minister of Health, and he was the one who promoted the decriminalization of Kratom. So we're making great progress in other countries too, as the science is understood, as the science dictates the policy, rather than the disinformation campaign that has been so widely circulated by the FDA and that others have repeated without any justification.
And Mac, do you think that the retail price of Kratom will shoot way up upon passing the Kratom Consumer Protection Act? I mention this because a similar thing occurred when nicotine vaping materials became regulated, causing nearly all of the retailers to close their doors.
So this is a great question. The current price of Kratom is dictated by the import alert, which makes it very difficult for farmers to export from Indonesia, those 200,000 farmers I mentioned earlier, into the United States because of the risk of the product being seized, or because there aren't good GMP standards, because the import alert is in effect. And so the Indonesian government can't take a position where they could have a set of standards, because that would identify who's shipping from Indonesia, and they would be obligated then to report that to the FDA, and then you'd see the import alert being slapped on those individuals. Not for good science, by the way, not because it's contaminated, because the FDA doesn't like it. And so that artificially inflates the price of Kratom today. If you remove the import alert, then it opens up a whole new competitive channel. And so I think that there's going to be, you'll see price competition, particularly with Thailand entering the marketplace now, where you have substantial competition. And so that will moderate prices. What is true is that, and I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again, and I know that there's some in the Kratom community that won't like what I'm going to say, but there are people who take advantage of the Facebook farmers who are saying, buy my Kratom, and they'll tell you it's tested, and they'll tell you that it's handled properly. I have been in those villages where they're processing Kratom, and I can tell you that the majority of the Kratom farmers who are telling you that they're testing or they're processing to make sure that the Kratom isn't contaminated are not doing so. And they're able to undercut the Kratom that goes through the process of being evaluated and, importantly, tested before it leaves Indonesia, and then tested again when it comes into the United States. That does associate a price, to the Kratom product that's going to increase the price. If you are buying from a Kratom farmer who tells you, I do all that. I'm telling you they don't. And I'm telling you that you should not be purchasing that Kratom. That suppresses the price of legitimate Kratom, and it creates a black market for Kratom that creates a real danger for consumers in the United States. Now, you are playing roulette when you buy it that way, because will it have salmonella? I don't know. Will it have levels of salmonella that are high enough to make you sick? I don't know. But you don't either, because it has to be tested. And if it tests positive for salmonella or E. coli, it needs to be destroyed or remediated. And you can't rely upon someone who's, telling you on Facebook it's safe. So my recommendation is buy from legitimate vendors. Look to the AK website to see those that are qualified under GMP standards, because then you reduce the risk of getting a product that's contaminated. You certainly don't reduce the risk of an adulterated product. But I get this price issue. We all would like to have very cheap commodities, but we're going to have to pay the price to make sure that we have a safe product, because otherwise the whole industry will implode. Because the first time you get a dangerous product that has not been tested, not gone through GMP practices into the United States that causes a death because it's contaminated, E. coli or salmonella, then that's the death knell for this industry. So we're going to have to tolerate some level of pricing competition at a level that allows for the testing procedures to take place and proper GMP procedures to be put into place to manufacture safe Kratom products, and labeled properly as well.
Great. And what is the latest estimate on the economic size of the Kratom industry and online versus brick and mortar retail, if you know?
So next week, we're going to publish the update on the economic impact analysis, both in the United States and in Indonesia. And it will be a fascinating read for everyone. I'll give you the highlight. It's about a $1.5 billion industry in America. And that's a stunted growth because of the FTA's position on the import alert, and because of their blocking legal access to Kratom and interfering with good commerce. So I think that when we get rid of that import alert, you're going to see an explosion of growth in the Kratom industry going forward. But this will be a great read for you. It will be available next week, be released next week to the public.
And can Kratom show up as buprenorphine on a drug screen?
I don't know. Not a good one. There's no way that a properly constructed drug screen will identify Kratom as buprenorphine unless there's buprenorphine in it, because Kratom's alkaloids and the metabolites don't mirror buprenorphine. Now, if you're looking at the effects of Kratom, it has buprenorphine-like effects, obviously, because it goes to the section of the brain that reduces pain. And it also has very exciting research that Dr. McCurdy's doing right now. They call it the alpha adrenergic receptors, which are the same receptors that are acted upon by Narcan. So when that's administered, it unbinds the binding effect of opioids and other drugs. And that's why it brings people back from respiratory suppression. But the scientists are now finding that Kratom has a similar effect with the alpha adrenergic receptors, which is why it's so effective in weaning people off of addictions with other drugs. And so testing has got to be straight up. It's not going to find that it's contaminated or adulterated unless it is. And then if it is, we obviously want it to be removed from the marketplace.
Excellent. And at this point, we'll close the Q&A and wrap up with the last few questions here. Are there any consumer grade products available that we can use to measure the quality of our Kratom, contaminants, mold, metals, etc.? I understand most Kratom sold in the US has lab results per batches. However, it would be useful to be able to do our own due diligence.
So in order for us to get the Kratom Consumer Protection Act passed, what we have advocated for is that we have a product manufacturer has to go through GMP standards. They have to validate it with their certificate of analysis. Now, you're not going to test every batch of material, but you're going to test every finished product. And so if what we tell the states is that if they get a report about a potential problem with a product, they should require the manufacturer to produce the certificate of analysis of the testing for that product, which they would have done internally, but then also to require them to go to an independent lab to validate that test in order to maintain selling the Kratom product in their state. This is the way that the dietary supplement industry is regulated in the United States. everyone has access in America to the adverse event reporting portal at the FDA, and they can make those reports. And when a cluster of reports is received by the FDA, then they act on them. And that's the way that it should work. We know the kratom is not, if it's pure kratom, is not going to be toxic. We know that it's not going to be dangerously addictive. If there are adverse events associated with it, and the outliers might be that you just have an allergic reaction to some of the ingredients of kratom, that's possible. But if they're looking for adulterants in the product, that's the way they'll find them and examine them. And that's what we encourage the states to do. There's no perfect system that for every finished product that you have a test available to you, you flip over the product and say, oh, well, this shows that it's really good stuff. This is what you don't want to do. And I want to show you, this is my Max Bargain Kratom. You don't want to buy this because you don't know what's in it. It's in a baggie, right? And there's no labeling on it, and there's nothing telling you what the ingredients or the metrogeny levels are, or if it's pure. You don't want to buy from Max Bargain Kratom. Too many manufacturers are out there doing just exactly this. And the only way to correct that is either legislatively or better, consumers rejecting it. Don't be induced by or seduced by the low price. Buy quality kratom that's manufactured according to GMP standards, that's labeled properly. If you pick up a package that doesn't have the name of the manufacturer and the address of that manufacturer on that label, put it back. Don't buy it. It's not worth the risk because you're playing roulette with your life. So I encourage everyone to stand up and be responsible consumers and buy from the manufacturers that are going through the steps that are necessary to ensure the safety of their products for you as consumers.
Great. Thank you, Mac. And I don't understand what is motivating the FDA. Is that their close ties to big pharma that see kratom cutting into their profits or their inability to control? Why is the FDA continuing this fight?
So the FDA's bias against kratom is really rooted in a long-standing, many decades-long battle against all dietary supplements and botanical products. Kratom just happens to be the substance of the day. The FDA hates dietary supplements. It's now almost a $60 billion industry. More than 80% of American families use dietary supplements and vitamins to maintain their health and well-being. The FDA, if they had it in their power, would repeal the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act that passed in 1994 that created that industry, that protected consumers, that gave them access to these kinds of products to make informed decisions about their health and well-being. The FDA hates it. Now, they've picked on kratom because you have one guy at the FDA that has, for the last 30 years, led the policy section in the commissioner's office who just doesn't like kratom. And so he abuses his authority, his regulatory authority, and he has demonized kratom. And that's what we see today. So we're fighting that battle all the time. And the one thing that individual doesn't have anymore that he had in 2016 was a free runway to lie. He can no longer lie indiscriminately. He can try, but we're able to counter with good science, with reasonable evaluations of the addiction liability based on good research rather than just his bias or the policy group's bias. And that we're able to rely upon the science that looks at the addiction liability and the safety profile of kratom. That's out there. And so we make the arguments based on science, and they have to run and hide. And they want to argue, oh, well, we've got these reports from a bunch of trial lawyers about deaths. Well, how about proving it? How about proving it? We know the 44 deaths that they produced and as evidence in the 8-factor analysis they submitted in 2017. Those 44 deaths, when we looked at and FOIA'd the autopsy reports and the tox screens, they were shockingly poor, according to Jane Babin, the independent toxicologist and attorney that evaluated them. And NIDA did their own study on the same data, and they came to the same conclusion. So here's the troubling aspect. Where did the FDA get the authority to play the games with the safety of the American people the way that they're doing now? Their bias should not be allowed to continue when they're wrong, when it's not based on good science, and they should not allow this bias to continue any longer. And that's why the Protecting Consumer Access to Kratom Act at the federal level is essential to the big sunlight coming in on the FDA and forcing them to produce all of the evidence and put it up on their website. When the World Health Organization Expert Committee on Drug Dependence evaluated kratom, The FDA did everything they could to stymie public comment. They didn't want you commenting on it. And yet when we were able to go to court with them and force them into conceding and opening the comment period for a longer period of time, 80,000 Americans spoke up and said that Kratom was safe, that the FDA was wrong about it, and that the World Health Organization should reject the FDA's nonsense. Well, the time's come for the US Congress to reject the FDA's nonsense too. It's time for the American public to be protected from the disinformation campaign that the FDA has waged for Kratom for far too long with impunity. And now it's time for there to be accountability. And that accountability comes in the form of this federal legislation that we want everyone to call their House of Representatives members and their senators and tell them to join the fight with us.
That's great. And just one final question for the evening, Mac. Do we have true growers here in the States that are subjected to the FDA, or is it only imported?
So this is great news that we actually have a fledgling Kratom industry of growers in Hawaii. I was just there at a Council of State Governments meeting early in December and talked with the Kratom Farmers Growers Group, the state senator and House member who are going to champion the Kratom Consumer Protection Act in Hawaii are connected with those farmers now. We also have a healthy industry growing in Florida. We know that the citrus industry in Florida was decimated by a disease that wiped out the citrus crops, and the state of Florida invested in looking at whether Kratom could be a replacement crop and whether it was going to be susceptible to the same kind of disease. It's not. And so we're seeing some real progress there. But the reality is that the growth of Kratom consumption in the United States will never be served by Hawaii or Florida. We're going to have to beat the import alert. We're going to have to continue to import Kratom from now Africa, which is a very big source of Kratom now, and in Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand. And so we're going to make that our cause célèbre moving forward when we get this federal act passed.
That's great, Mac. And do you have any further closing comments before we end the call?
Pick up the phone, call your representatives, tell them your story, ask them to sign on as a co-sponsor to the Federal Protect Consumer Access to Kratom Act. It is the most important thing you can do. Sign up to be a Kratom protector. Help us to be advocates. We're going to be fighting in the States this year as well. So we need everyone's help. We're going to continue our fight. I'm absolutely committed to it. I think that the AKA is, despite criticism, we're not perfect. We can't get to everybody all of the time. I know we're not as responsive because we have a small staff to do all the things that people would like us to do. We do our best and we're committed to it. And I can tell you that as challenging as it may sometimes be to think, or frustrating, I should say, that AK isn't doing everything that you want us to do. We're doing our doggonedest to make sure that this gets across the finish line. And with your help, we're going to be able to successful. Think about where we were in 2016. When I was hired to come on, and I told them, you have no chance. You might be able to build an administrative record where you could challenge them in court when they tried to reimpose after the 2 years. There had never been ever a rescission of a scheduling recommendation under the emergency section of the Controlled Substances Act, but it happened with Kratom. No one believed it. And here we are today, 6 years later, and we're on the precipice of adding more and more states to the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And we're on the brink of getting the federal government to stomp on the FDA and make them accountable for what they've been doing for the past 6 years. Well, actually longer than that, but certainly for the last 6 years in promoting their disinformation campaign against Kratom. So help us do that. And that would make a great Happy New Year, and certainly Happy New Year to everyone's family and to each of you. And thank you for your support. And for those that are listening, and I know you're there, that are gagging at what I'm saying, we feel the same way about you. We want there to be a safe community. We want for your loved ones to be protected. And you may not believe it, but we're sincere about that. And we want to find ways to regulate this marketplace to make sure that people are protected from adulterated products. And we're committed to you in that goal just as much as we are to the rest of the Kratom community. So God bless everyone. And I hope that we can continue to work together for great success in 2023.
That's great. Well, Happy New Year. Thank you, Mac. Thank you, everyone.